I'm Yoram Solomon, and this is the Book of Trust. Chapter 10, the seventh law of trust. Trust is two-sided. A month before I was born, my father was hospitalized. He was diagnosed with kidney stones in such an advanced stage that he was told that one of his kidneys had to be removed. And so it was. 30 years later, after living 30 years on one kidney, he passed away. Not from kidney failure, but from a heart attack. He suffered for a while from heart disease, and it finally caught up with him. When my mother called me, I was in the middle of a major training exercise with my reserve military service. She said that he was in bad shape and that I should come back home. I did, but I missed his passing by 30 minutes. I stayed at their home, still wearing my battle dress uniform, as we said Shiva. It is the Jewish tradition of mourning for 7 days at the house of the deceased. During that time, with almost nothing else to do, my mother started going through old paperwork. As she went through paperwork related to my father's kidney removal in 1964, she began to recognize some of the medical terminology that she didn't know before. You see, my mother had cancer just 2 years before my father's passing, and the terms that she never knew before her cancer were now familiar, and she recognized those terms in my father's 1964 hospital paperwork. So she was puzzled, and she called a close family member who spent a lot of time at the hospital with them at that time of my father's hospitalization in 1964. Their conversation went something like this. This is my mother. Did the doctors ever talk to you about his condition? She asked. Yes. Did they tell you that he had kidney cancer and not kidney stones? Yes. My mother was stunned. That was the first time that she learned that my father had cancer 30 years ago. Why didn't they say anything to us? Why didn't they speak with you? Why did they only speak with you? My relative explained that the doctor came to her and recognized that she must have been a very close relative to spend that much time with my parents at the hospital. No doubt she never left their side and was very supportive. The doctors then told her that my father had cancer and believed he was in too much pain to take this kind of news right then, and my mother, 8 months pregnant with me, was in no shape to hear that news either. Do you think I should tell them, or would you rather tell them yourself? The doctor asked that relative. I'll tell them when the time is right, was her answer. She didn't. Not until 30 years later, when my father had passed away. For 30 years, my father didn't know that he had cancer. Who knows? This might have been a blessing for him not to know and not to have this hang over his head for 30 years. However, every time he filled medical forms since then, every time he was asked whether he had a history of cancer, he answered no. For 27 years, until my mother had her first encounter with cancer, every time I filled my own medical forms and was asked whether there is a history of cancer in my family, I answered no. And for 24 years, my sister did the same. This could have happened today could not have happened today with all the HIPAA regulations and the bureaucracy associated with it. At the moment when I realized that this was kept as a secret from my family for so long, I lost trust in people. My starting point in a relationship was I don't trust you at all. We are the sum of our experiences. Some of us got burned badly by trusting other people and therefore suffering the negative consequences of misplacing that trust. I'm pretty sure that the former customers of Bernie Madoff and Marcella Zavala Taylor were less trusting of investment advisors and bankers than the general population is. At least now they are. Maybe they're less trusting of anyone as a result of the very significant consequences of the trust betrayals that they have suffered. The level of trust that you are willing to extend to me is the product of two variables. Your trustability, your willingness to trust other people in general or in specific context, and my trustworthiness. Trust that person A has in person B is the product of persons A trustability, and persons B trustworthiness. Your trustability is determined by the sum of your experiences, but is driven by another factor too. To explain this other factor, I must first ask a philosophical question. Is the total amount of trust extended to one person limited? Extended by one person, limited. Using my definition of trust, it is measured by your willingness to accept the possible negative consequences of giving control over things that you have. Therefore, the total amount of trust a person may extend is limited to the maximum total amount of negative things that can happen to that person. To simplify the following example, I'll assume that the only negative consequence that you may suffer are limited to losing money and not getting it back. Obviously, the more money you have, the more negative consequences you may suffer. Therefore, at initial glance, it may appear that the more you have, the more trust you may have to extend. However, if you had more money, wouldn't the same amount of money mean less to you? Wouldn't losing $20 mean less to you if you had $1 million in your account than if you only had $100? Let me take this to a more emotional subject. Would losing a child mean less to you if you had 3 children than if this was your only child? I realize how provocative this question is and that nobody could answer this affirmatively, but I'm going to assume that a person's ability to lose or accept negative consequences is limited, and one could even say fixed. Maybe the limit is the level of suffering endured by Job, as described in the Bible. And speaking of the Bible, it's time to make an additional assertion. The total amount of trust that one person can extend is the sum of the amount of trust that person extends to God, to himself, to other people, and to things. But before discussing this statement, I would like to share a folk story with you. A very religious man was once caught in rising floodwater. He climbed onto the roof of his house and trusted God to rescue him. A neighbor came by in a canoe and said, "The waters will soon be above your house. Hop in and we'll paddle to safety." "No thanks," replied the religious man. "I have prayed to God, and I'm sure that He will save me." A short time later, as the water keeps on rising, the police came in a boat. "The waters will soon be above your house. Hop in and we'll take you to safety." "No thanks," replied the religious man. "I've prayed to God, and I'm sure that He will save me." A little time later, a rescue services helicopter hovered overhead, let down a rope ladder, and said, "The water will soon be above your house. Climb the ladder, and we will fly you to safety." "No thanks," replied the religious man. "I've prayed to God, and I'm sure that He will save me." At this time, the flood water continued to rise until soon they reached above the roof, and the religious man drowned. When he arrived in heaven, he demanded an audience with God. Ushered into God's throne room, he said, "Lord, why am I here in heaven? I prayed for you to save me. I trusted you to save me from the flood." "Yes, you did, my child," replied the Lord. "And I sent you a canoe, a boat, and a helicopter, but you never got in." We trust God. Some of us trust Him more, and some of us trust Him less. There is a range of trust levels between the highly religious and the atheist. And then we trust things. An article published in Aviation magazine in 2015 caught my attention. According to that article, the President of the United States flies on one more aircraft beyond the iconic Air Force One, and that's the Marine One helicopter. Mostly on short rides that start or end on the White House lawn, just south of the main residence. Marine One is not always the same helicopter. It varies between the VH-3 Sea King and the VH-60 White Hawk. Any helicopter becomes Marine One as soon as the president set foot on it. The Marine squadron that operates those helicopters has 12 Boeing V-22 Ospreys, the hybrid helicopter airplane that can take off and land vertically but can also tilt the rotors forward and fly faster than any other helicopter. However, the president is not allowed on any of them. The early days of the V-22 Osprey were fraught with fatal accidents. 2 Ospreys crashed in 2000, killing both crews and 15 passengers on one of them. As a result, the aircraft earned the dubious nickname the Widowmaker. After the Osprey served the Marine Corps for several years in the Middle East, officials said that it was a safe and reliable aircraft. But the Marine squadron allocated to serve the White House is still forbidden to use the Osprey to carry the commander-in-chief until it can be trusted. It is trusted enough to carry troops in and out of battle and carry the presidential support personnel and members of the media, just not the president. We trust people, we trust God, but we also trust or don't trust things. And once again, you can also see that trust is continuous and not binary. We don't trust the Osprey enough to carry the president, but we trust it enough to carry everyone else. What do we mean when we say that we trust things? Really, we trust people. The people who built those things, the people who designed them, the people who maintained them, the people who inspected them, the companies who hired those people, and specifically the people who run those companies. Trusting things really means trusting people you don't know. And we tend to do that too. So, whether you decide to trust or not trust the Boeing 737 MAX to take you safely to your destination without the MCAS or the maneuvering characteristics augmentation system causing a crash, you are really trusting or not trusting the people who designed the plane, the people who wrote the software to it, built it, tested it, and the combination of all of them is represented by the Boeing brand name. And thus, the level of trust that I have is limited to the maximum negative consequences I can endure. It is the sum of the levels of trust that I have in 4 different entities. 3 of them are God, other people, and things, or the people behind those things. There is one more entity that I trust, and that is myself. We differ from one another in the level of trust that we have in ourselves. Some people trust themselves more than others, and some less. Leaders who micromanage their employees typically trust themselves more than they trust their employees. Some people know that they could do the job better than others and therefore would rather do everything themselves. That doesn't make them bad people. So mathematically speaking, again, the total level of trust that you have is the sum of trust that you have in God, in yourself, in other people, and in things. Trust total equals trust in God plus trust in self plus trust in people plus trust in things. What does this equation even mean? First, that a person's ability is a zero-sum, ability to trust is a zero-sum game. The more that person trusts God, the less they can trust other people, things, or himself. Second, that whenever the level of trust that a person has in one of the 4 declines, the more he trusts the other 3, or 1 or 2 of them. What would happen if the trustworthiness of someone you trusted declines because they betrayed your trust? One of 2 things, or combination of the 2, would happen. The level of trustability you have will decline, thus causing you to trust God or yourself more, or you would shift the trust that you have in people generally to other people. Trustability is different across generations as well. A 2019 Pew Research Center study showed that younger people are significantly less prone to trust other people. While 48% of adults ages 65 and above believe that most of the time people just look out for themselves, 73% of young people, the ages of 18 to 29, believe the same thing. Only 29% of adults ages 65 and above agrees that most people can't be trusted, compared to 60% of young people ages 18 to 29. Less than half. In summary, the premise of the seventh law of trust is that the amount of trust that I'm willing to extend to you is the product of my willingness to trust other people in general and your trustworthiness. And the mathematical equations that I proposed was the trust that person A has in person B is the product of the trustability of person A by the trustability of person B, the trustworthiness of person B. There's almost nothing you can do about the former, but everything you can do about the latter. And that's a great segue to part 3 of this book, in which I'll show you a new model to understand and build your own trustworthiness. But before that, I must make a small clarification. I just told you that there is almost nothing that you can do about my trustability or my willingness to trust other people or you specifically in general. Note that I said almost, because there is, albeit very little, something you can do about it. See, my trustability refers to my willingness to trust other people in general, not just you. However, that trustability is driven by my experience in trusting all people and their respective trustworthinesses. If everyone I knew increased their trustworthiness by 10%, my trustability will likely increase by the same 10%. However, you can't affect everyone's trustworthiness. You can only control your own. If you are one of 10 people that I trust equally, and you increase your own trustworthiness by 10%, while the other 9 didn't change their trustworthiness at all, my overall willingness to trust people will likely increase by 1%. So when you become more trustworthy, it will increase my trustability, even if only by a little. The true trustworthiness cycles demonstrate the micro-level relationship on the left between trustworthiness and trust. If you're trustworthy, I will trust you. The macro-level relationship on the right shows that trustworthiness will eventually have impact on trustability and not only on trust, although it has a smaller impact which takes longer to materialize. Now we're ready to move on to part 3.